I am just watching to see how we're doing on attendee login. I'm going to get started in just a moment, but my name is Alva Kiley. I'm one of the plastic surgery specialty trainees who's involved in the BFIRST trainee committee. And I've got a panel, which is a combination of members of the BFIRST trainee committee, our consultant supervisor, Mr. Adam Reid, and I'm very pleased to have guest panelists joining us from the paper that we're discussing. So Katie, I wonder if you can have a little look at the attendee list and then give me the nod when it's good to start.
Yeah, I think people are logging in.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Yeah, all right, let's get going. So just a very quick word about introducing the two societies and then our panelists formally. So BFIRST trainees are a community of doctors and medical students who are UK based and work alongside the main BFIRST committee, whose goal is building sustainable global relationships between the UK and LMICs. And our aim, I suppose, as a trainee committee specifically, is to share resources and promote sort of responsible trainee involvement in the overall overseas activity of the committee. So I'm going to invite Haneen Abed, who's the president of the BSSH Global Partnerships Trainee Committee, to let you know about her society.
Thanks, Alva. So hi, my name's Haneen. I'm currently a plastics registrar in the West Midlands Deanery, and essentially I'm the current chair of the BSSH Global Partnership Trainees Committee that used to be called the Overseas Committee and has been recently renamed. So we work alongside the main BSSH Overseas Committee, which is a group of consultants, and the Trainees Committee is essentially made up of registrars from both orthopaedic and plastic surgery background. And our overall aim as a committee is to use the BSSH resource to deliver maximum possible benefit for patients in need of hand surgery in the developing world. We often coordinate trainees to go out to LMIC countries, and our current project country as a whole is the Lion project in Malawi, and I've just come back a week ago from Malawi. So we often are involved with lots of different LMIC countries, and our main purpose is to develop and disseminate educational content. So yeah.
So also on the panel we have our immediate past president from the BFIRST Trainee Committee, Katie Dixon. We have our consultant supervisor, who's Mr. Adam Reid. Adam Reid is a consultant plastic surgeon in Manchester. He's also the JPRAS journal deputy editor, which is the journal in which this paper was published, and he's a member of the BFIRST main committee. So we welcome Mr. Reid and we thank him for his contributions. Then looking at our guest panelists, so we have Prof. Makona Nashetti, who's senior author on this paper. He's a consultant plastic surgeon at Yekaterinburg in Ethiopia. He's also an associate professor and has a PhD. Mr. Callum Honeyman, we hope, is going to be able to join us a little bit later on the call. He's currently scrubbed in a case, but he's an ST8 trainee in the Scotland Deanery, and he's also a long-term volunteer with Project Hurrah, which is the main project behind which this paper was generated. And then we have the first author on the paper, Mr. Henry de Berke. He's an ST3 trainee in the Northwest Deanery and also a volunteer with Project Hurrah. So just to give an overview of what the order of events will be, I'm going to give a 5-point summary of the paper. Then we're going to run through a section by section analysis with invitation of contributions from the attendees and the panelists. And then we're going to finish with some closing thoughts and some case discussions presented to us by Prof. Makona, which should be really interesting. So why did we choose this paper? So I think some of the main reasons why are that this is a multiple country collaboration. It addresses some of the challenges with building sustainable free tissue transfer in LMIC countries. and it may provide a model for establishing these sustainable local orthoplastic services. So lots of interesting, thought-provoking ideas being brought up by this paper. In terms of this 5-point summary, so it's a systematic review and meta-analysis of outcomes following microsurgical free tissue transfer performed on international reconstructive surgery collaborations in LMICs. So it's a variety of different providers of these collaborations, which we'll look at in a little bit in the results. They're mainly looking at free flap failure rate and other complications. It is a systematic review performed in the usual manner with multiple authors, and they've performed a meta-analysis of proportions here, which we'll talk about shortly as well. And I suppose the main discussion point behind all this is, how does this compare nationally, and what do we think of the results? So we'll move through a section by section analysis here. From the main question of, did this paper overall fulfill its aims and its PICO? I'm not going to dwell on this for very long, but I just wanted to highlight the aim of the paper was, again, to assess flap failure rate, to look at take back to theatre and overall complication rates as well. It's a non-comparative meta-analysis, which is why we've ended up with meta-analysis of proportions. And without further ado, I'm going to look at the introduction and background. So this is interesting, I think, for context. They haven't dwelled too long on the introduction here in the paper, but this first line, so over 60% of the world population lacks access to safe and affordable surgical care, which is from a paper in the Lancet. Amazing statistic to think about. We talk about what the gold standard is for complex composite defects, whether by say cancer resection or trauma, and many people will agree across the world that this will be free tissue transfer. I would love to invite audience members to write into the chat if you do have free tissue transfer in your unit or your centre, or have you worked somewhere that offers free tissue transfer. Do you know roughly what is the failure rate for free flaps in your unit? And then I've just added in at the bottom of this slide is that it's not necessarily published, but they spoke about at our last British National Plastic Surgery Conference that from the UK National Flap Registry, the flap failure rate is sitting around 2%, but there may be an element of underreporting here. So while we're waiting for chat responses, I wanted to ask Prof. McConan, so is there any provision at the moment for free tissue transfer at UCAT 12? I don't know whether he is muted at present.
No, we don't have any activity, any provision of free tissue transfer currently.
Because I think that's really important for us to know in context before we even dive into the paper. And I think we can delve into what the reasons behind this are a little bit later when we go through your case discussion. So more on that to come. Does anyone from the panel have a comment on the introduction or background before we move on to the next section?
I'd just be quite interested to know what the thinking was that started the systematic review. Was it something that happened, or was it looking at the flap registries in other countries and wondering whether that could be replicated elsewhere?
So I've got Henry with his hand up. Henry, do you want to answer that one?
Oh yeah, I'll take that, I think. So within Project Hurrah, which is a charity that provides reconstructive surgery to people living in Ethiopia, often from rural settings, there was a bit of an ongoing debate as to whether during their complex surgical trips to Ethiopia, which are part of a broader range of activities that they do, whether they should be offering free tissue transfer. And one of the other senior authors who's not with us is a head and neck surgeon called Mark McGurk, had limited experience in providing free flaps in Ethiopia, and had felt from that anecdotal experience that it was a high risk strategy, was worried really, even if he was faced with problems that, or patients with problems that might require free tissue transfer in a high income setting. And so that was the kind of basis for why we started on this journey. Additionally, I guess if you're ever trying to set up a service, you have to have context specific data to cite to your patients. And at the moment, there's just not very much.
And not to jump the gun terribly, but did he change his mind after the paper?
Yeah, he was very surprised, I think, actually, by the outcomes of the paper. But I don't think that since we published, Project Hurrah still haven't managed a complex surgical trip since the pandemic. So we'll see what happens then.
I've got Mr. Reid ready to comment next.
Thanks very much. If I could ask Henry or Prof Mekanon about the authorship, there's quite a wide range of expertise within the authorship, from a wide range of geographical background and sub-surgical specialty background. I wonder what draws everybody together, and how did you work together on a singular aim?
I'll probably take that one, because I was kind of having to coordinate it all, I suppose. So all of the authors have some connection with that organisation, Project Hurrah, and have had some direct involvement on looking after patients who are requiring reconstructive surgery in Ethiopia. And then it's a mix of head and neck surgeons, dental surgeons, because quite a lot of the work that is done on these complex missions involves mandibular reconstruction for amyloblastoma or noma defects. And I think they're all interested parties, because they all were unclear on whether this was something they should be offering their patients. And so together we had a rich discussion on what actual data that we all wanted to obtain from these papers. And then they were obviously invaluable. Most of the authors are quite senior and were provided sort of invaluable criticism, really, of the meta-analysis as we went forward. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Katie, we got any stats from the chat?
So Prof McKennon has shared there's currently no free tissue transfer activity at his unit, and otherwise we don't have anybody's predicted flap survival rates at their unit.
And that, that's probably reasonable in the context of most units, because I think people can say colloquially, oh well, we've not had a take back in X amount of time, but I'm not sure how much self-auditing people are doing, or whether they know how to, even if using the UK flap registry, whether they know how to mine their statistics. So lots to think about there, and lots of context given. But if I just go back to the previous slide, the context that we can use as a baseline here is that the global reported flap failure rate is about, between 1.3 to 8.8%. So if we keep that in mind going forward for the results section, we can use that as a point of comparison. Lovely. So I will move us on to the methods. There's just a few things for members of the audience who are maybe less familiar with systematic review meta-analysis that I wanted to go through. So some of the things like, so Henry and his team have been really methodical in how they've gone about this, and that's what's really a top priority in systematic review meta-analysis. So they've done things like pre-publish the protocol, and mentioned, where in the actual paper it's deviated from protocol, which is important. They've registered it on Prospero, which is an online registry system for systematic review, whereby duplicate work is rejected. Then they have used the PRISMA reporting guidelines, which are specific reporting guidelines for systematic review. And they've gone about it with the usual methodology. So 2 independent reviewers, and then had some input, I suppose, from all the other authors as well. In terms of the method series, so as I mentioned already, it's a non-comparative meta-analysis, which is really only probably due to the study designs of the contributing papers. They've used an appropriate risk of bias tool, which is an important element of systematic review. And they've also used different tools for reporting of the confidence of the evidence, such as grade. So I thought I just wanted to ask Henry to explain to the audience members who'd be less familiar with meta-analysis of proportions, what sort of the principles are and what the benefits are of using this method to collate data from, say, case series.
So it became very clear early on that we weren't going to be able to look at studies that provided comparative data. And so we were looking at rates, i.e. binary outcomes, yes or no, was there a failure? So from that, you have your proportions, and then you have to decide how to weight the studies. And in our study, that's based on the standard error of the studies, which basically means, which is closely tied to the size of each study, to be honest, but it's the degree of variation within each study is a determinant of how high a weighting it gets when you come up with your final number.
Yeah,
and it involves a lot of modeling that as a clinician, you have to trust the modeling to some degree, and you base it on previous experience of, and you have to cite lots of other papers because the modeling is very complex.
Yeah, and I can definitely appreciate from an authorship point of view how challenging this can be as a clinician who doesn't necessarily have access to statistical help, because this requires, a whole different tool where you have to write the code to do a meta-analysis of proportions. So hats off to you, Henry, for figuring that out. It's not easy. But I suppose in my head, in simple terms, meta-analysis of proportions literally means that instead of saying, all right, well, this paper, the flap failure rate's 4%, and then this other paper, which has X amount of patients included, the flap failure rate is 8%. So is the flap failure rate 6%? No, it's not really. And that's why meta-analysis proportions is a useful tool, because it will weight the studies differently and give you a result that applies that weight and the modeling that's actually accurate. And I think if you've been reading the paper, sometimes it's difficult to digest the forest plots directly, but essentially there's a means of just converting them into rates, which Henry and his team have done in the discussion. I think yields itself well to an overall understanding of what all the contributing papers are saying. So any comments on the method section from our panel?
Apologies if it was published in an appendix, but what were the search terms that you used? How did I'm just interested in how you managed to get papers that included international collaborations.
It's published in the protocol. I'm not sure whether it's actually published in the JPRAS one. Off the top of my head, I can't remember all of the different search terms. There was a lot of trial and error, and we also, doing a good quality reference search of the papers that you do find is so valuable, to pick up all those papers that you might have missed with your search terms. they were pretty exhaustive in our opinion, but we still picked up some papers through the reference search. That's so important.
Yeah, and at the risk of jumping ahead to results, I mean, to go from, you start with something like 3,000 papers, isn't it? So that's why you have to have such an exhaustive search strategy. And then, like you say, it goes into, yeah, reference review to fine tune what exactly are the final few.
And did you hand search the references?
As in, we read through all the reference lists.
Very
what
impressive.
do you mean?
So that you can use various apps like Citation Chaser that will forward and backward search for you.
I wish I had known about those, but I don't know whether they're as reliable as you know, reading the thing. There might be more, but no, we just hand searched it. Yeah.
Great work. Very impressive.
So at this point, I just wanted to also address our attendees and say that if anyone does want to raise a hand to make a specific point, you're very welcome to do so. And we'll have a look at the attendee list periodically to see what we can offer in terms of opportunities to contribute. But please use the chat as and when you want. Yeah, so we want as much contribution as possible, or if you want to just listen, that's absolutely fine as well. So I'll have a quick look through the results in a few different sections here. This first slide just gives us an overall feel for the results. So as I said, initially, Henry and the team screened about, over 3,000 studies. 38 papers were included in a full text analysis and 7 in the final analysis, all of which were case series, which is the type of thing that we would have really expected in this type of theme of paper. The contributing countries were Nepal, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Vietnam, Senegal, Myanmar, and Kenya. 290 FAPs and 284 patients. And in the paper itself, table 1 details lots of interesting narrative results about the plastic surgery collaborations between which organizations and which countries, and sort of how they took shape, how the initial collaboration went, and then whether or not these are sustainable and so on and so forth. I've detailed a little bit about it. I don't want to directly read through all these with you all, but I think some of them are quite interesting, and some of them tie into what BFIRST's ethos is for building sustainable relationships with LMICs. And so an example here is so Operation Smile, where they have an educational conference as part of each trip. The hospital runs a microsurgery course. They've donated equipment. They've donated loupes and a microscope. And they've invited Vietnamese surgeons to go on fellowship and then go back and continue to practice. So that's an interesting one. I see that Henine's got her hand up. I don't know if you want to comment on this slide. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is, perhaps I relate to it a little bit because I've just been out to Malawi, but I had a quick question for you, Henry, if that's okay. I guess this slide highlights that there is often a big contribution from charities abroad that come out with experienced, skilled surgeons that come out and do some of these operations, that do it quite regularly in the UK. But often, many of the surgeons aren't able to stay for the perioperative, post-operative period. And often the nursing staff and some of the other healthcare professionals that look after the patients aren't familiar with looking after patients with free tissue transfers. Do you feel that this was a big contributing factor? Did you consider this when you were looking at the data? And, you know, perhaps it's on a bigger scale than just the paper itself, but I find it on a personal perspective, something quite important when considering big operations like free tissue transfers, when the local surgeons and local healthcare professionals aren't used to doing it.
I think I'll say something that maybe Prof. McKernan wants to have something to say as well about that. I had to contact most of the authors of these papers because often the data I needed wasn't quite there. And so that ended up in quite an interesting narrative with quite a few of them. And so I think all of the things that you say are quite valid, but that's why the whole emphasis behind this paper was that these trips, previously known as missions, mainly are actually supposed to be and should be going forward collaborations that involve a partnership that is long lasting. And particularly Kieran Nakami, who I think is based in, has received BFIRST trips actually. I'm trying to remember, I think it's Nepal where they're based. And he gave me some great insights into the challenges that they face, but also that part of the training had to be to the anaesthetists, had to be to the MDT staff, as well as the local surgeons. And then in terms of the follow-up, that's another reason why it has to be very collaborative, because both the visiting surgeons and the local surgeons need to feel a sense that it's their patient. That was the feedback that I got from Kieran Nakami, but I don't know whether Prof McConan has a sense of whether he has enough support in his hospital to, if the surgeons were trained, would there still be problems with the ancillary staff and how we might tackle those?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the model we are following is a collaborative type, not like as a previous mission type, hit and run. So we are trying also to build capacity. In each step, when a volunteer comes to our unit, will be fully involved in surgery, in follow-up of the patients, and our supportive staff also will be involved, including the nurses, the anesthesia staff, everybody. So the idea is little by little, we are also building capacity in all level of staff. So it is some sort of collaborative type. I don't know if I have addressed your question.
I think so.
No, you have. Thank you very much. Thanks. I guess it was just looking at the years, obviously, that you were looking at the papers, and it is a good point. Like, obviously, 100%, that's a lot of the charities' aims. That's what a lot of the projects perhaps I'm interested in, is the fact that it is a collaborative, but I think some of these probably were back when missions were the main aim and perhaps they weren't always present. Just a point.
Yeah, certainly some of the papers barely mentioned the capacity building in their trips, and it was all about outcomes.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the year, Haneen, and maybe something for us to look at when we look back at the paper again and say, you know, okay, well, this one that has no capacity building, was that from way back when the ethos was slightly different, or when, you know, everything was still a bit more trial and error and the idea of collaborative trips was only evolving.
But just that being said, the Operation Smile group, who run a conference every year and donated a lot, that paper's from 2007, and it's a series that ran over 11 years, and it probably took them a little while to process the data and stuff. So there were definitely some people who were practicing in quite a responsible manner and have been probably for quite a while. But I take your point. I think you're probably right that hopefully the majority of groups are now practicing in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, concerning the project with Operation Smile, I think after many years of mission trips to one of the university hospitals, Jimma, later on they start working on capacity building, and they trained. Maybe you met one of the trainees in Malawi. He is now currently in Malawi. He was trained under with the support of Operation Smile. So
I did. I met Operation Smile out in the long way. Yeah,
maybe you met Dr. Daniel, who is trained in Taiwan as a microsurgeon, as a plastic surgeon. Also, he did microsurgery. So before, when they started, it was just a mission, but later on it was changed into capacity building. Now they have established a cleft center, which provides somehow multidisciplinary care. So we were looking for that type of collaboration, like building capacity a little bit. So our model with Project Haran is that, it started from patient evaluation, assessment, preparing for surgery, and almost the follow-up is done by local staff. After the surgical team has left, the foreign surgeons and the foreign staff left will continue the follow-up so that we are building capacity.
Yeah, I think these narrative results definitely make you think about what we can learn from different collaborations, a bit like what you've said, Prof. McConan. So you're saying Project Harar looks at some of the models like Operation Smile and sees what parts of it would be useful to apply to different elements of plastic surgery. And I'm sure, Henry, you would have seen a lot of interesting contributing models here by speaking to those study authors. So, we've looked at things like fellowships, and that's something that BFIRST does as well. Then obviously sustained trips, so say similar surgeons going out to similar places on a yearly basis, which is it just started back up from a BFIRST point of view. And then some of these other things maybe we haven't been doing, or we could do, or we could think about doing, like the micro workshops. But it's interesting. We can certainly all learn from each other. And I think it seems like across these different collaborations and organizations, there is a global move towards collaboratives for sustainable global surgery, which is really, really good. So any other comments from the panel or from the audience before we look at other elements of the results?
So we've got a question from Dan Lazenby. With regards to following collaborations, was there any mention of availability of surgeons or MDT input via methods such as WhatsApp calls or Zoom? Perhaps a sustainable way of local staff asking questions regarding complications and follow-up following complex surgery. So did any of the papers from your memory mention any of this, Henry? The use of technology to be able to
not really, no, but actually, not to bang the drum a little bit about Project Harar, but they not so long ago published in JPRAS about using mobile phone follow-up following their last mission, which was in 2020, I think, or last trip, sorry, which was in 2020, and locally employed staff employed by Project Harar locally disseminated questionnaires via mobile phones, and there was something like I think they sent that to 26 patients. 23 of them completed the questionnaires, and 19 of them provided clinical photographs, of which some of them were not high quality enough, but others were excellent quality. So it's definitely something that is being looked at going forward, but I don't remember reading anything in the papers that are included.
Mr. Reid, do you have any experience of that sort of format of follow-up from a BFIRST side?
Yeah, this is a mechanism which is used pretty commonly in projects, BFIRST projects, and with partners. I have good communication with some of my partners in Zimbabwe, a colleague in Nigeria, and we regularly text about various cases or use WhatsApp. I think it's a useful tool. I know that BFIRST have been using this with surgeons in Ukraine as well. So it's a useful tool to spread information and to I suppose help engage and help plan and provide some confidence to surgeons who may not be as familiar with some of the pathologies or traumas that we're seeing.
Absolutely, you can't value the phone a friend tool enough, I think, especially things like new consultants or any cases that we're maybe not familiar with. So even in an informal setting, it sounds like a reliable tool. So I'm going to have a look at some of these challenges because I think there's lots to talk about here as well. So Henry and his team had a look at what some of the particular challenges were to the setup of a free tissue transfer service in these countries, if detailed by the study authors. So these were some of the things that came up. So things like malnutrition of the patients that they were operating on, power outages, overnight theatre availability for potential take-backs to theatre, equipment availability, and issues with staffing. So I would love if anyone from the audience can write in the chat about any potential solutions to these challenges. Just have a brainstorm and think, how could these be overcome? Feel free to raise your hand if you want to make a specific comment as well. And then a question, I suppose, for Prof. McConan and Henry, to some extent, from the viewpoint of a visiting surgeon, sort of across many years on a project like Project Hurrah, how do you find a balance between what might be sort of considered gold standard surgical care for anything really, not necessarily just free flaps in the UK or wherever, and then balancing that with what's safe and possible to execute in Ethiopia in your case, but I suppose question for everybody.
Was that for me?
Well, for both of you, I suppose. Maybe
Yeah.
Prof. McConan first.
I think Prof would be much better placed to answer that one.
Yes, I think many of the things listed here, during my training, I've been to India, to UK also. So many of the things listed here as a problem are there. In Project RR, what you used to do is for a major surgery, like we do pre-operative rehabilitation of the patients, which is actually lacking. We don't have such a tradition. Patients are traveling from a distance, and there is no to keep them for rehabilitation center, pre and post-operative. That's one huge problem. And the staffing. For example, if you do a flap, in ideal setup, there should be a flap duty, someone who is looking into the flap. That tradition is not there. That's a huge problem. So I got the chance to see, like in Norway also. So we are really, there is a huge disparity between low-income countries and high-income countries, which need to be somehow solved, because as I mentioned in my slides, surgery now is really a public health issue. We have a lot of trauma, road traffic accident is growing, burn injury is the same. So there should be a change. We cannot continue as it is. So sometimes, maybe because you don't have any access to microsurgery, to an advanced surgery, maybe, for example, in the case of limb, amputation might be, the solution we will have. So there is a huge disparity between these two worlds, which I think should be addressed. Currently, there is slight improvement. For example, in my unit, there are residents who can look overnight for flaps, like there is a 24-hour duty, resident duty, 2 residents and 2 general practitioners. There is slight improvement from probably from your last mission, Henry, but still
little connection issue, I think. It's a shame. We have a question from the chat which ties into this, I think, and maybe Mr. Reid will be able to answer it. So it's how much of an impact was cost in terms of the cost of a microscope, loops, small caliber sutures in non-charity work. So I think from Nat here, that's a question to visiting surgeons, how much that impacts what you can do on a trip.
Okay, so I can speak briefly about that. The cost is obviously an issue that needs to be addressed, and it depends upon what level of cost that is. In the places that I've been, although the plastic surgeons or the surgeons who are intending to perform reconstructive surgery, we actually got the microscopes from ENT surgeons who were not necessarily using it for microvascular surgery, but we were able to find a microscope that we could use. Clearly, if there's no microscope, then there may be an issue performing microsurgery. Sutures are very expensive, and good equipment is very expensive. They all have a kind of, in particular, microsurgical instruments have a startup cost, but it's very quickly that they get bent at the tips or have a problem and need serviced and looked after. So it's not just a case of leaving a set of microsurgical instruments behind. There needs to be an understanding that they will be looked after and what it takes to look after microsurgical instruments and whether the funding is there for that. So yeah, I think there's a lot to consider in this type of project in cost.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I'm back now. Electricity has gone again, but now I can use my mobile hotspot.
Nice. So this definitely constitutes one of the challenges that we've just talked about. So power shortages, etc. So you can imagine how that could potentially impact on the surgical side too.
Yeah.
So this slide is just up for us to digest as a panel and an audience about what the pooled rates from the meta-analysis of proportion side of things were. So from the 7 studies, the flap failure rate was 3.8%, partial failure rate 2.9%. The complications rate was relatively high here, so 38%, with less than 2% mortality. Emergency return to theatre, we're looking at 16%, but there's a successful salvage rate of 52% here. So it's important with a meta-analysis of proportions to look exactly at heterogeneity. So you're looking at what, were these contributing studies very different in terms of things like contributing, I suppose, how many numbers contributed to them, or whether their methods of collecting data were quite different. So this is reported at 7 to 63%. So I don't know if anyone wants to make a quick comment on this slide, or shall we move on to the discussion and limitations part? We're good. Okay, I'm going to move us on. So in the discussion, I think this is a really interesting part of the paper. Each outcome is discussed and compares to a higher income country setting. And I think the authors allude to the fact that this is hopefully going to be able to provide some context, which could be used, say, for patient counselling in an LMIC setting, for potential planning, to prove a proof of concept, and I suppose even from a narrative point of view, just to understand what other collaborations are doing and how this could be applied to your own collaboration. So lots of them are demonstrating a positive impact overall on local services. So I think, Henry, I think you might have something to say about this. I don't know if you want to talk to us about how the paper showed a sustained increase in caseload, justifying the economic need, and then how that balances against provision.
Yeah, I think that the part of the justification will be a clinical one, and that will come from Prof. McConan. But I've just put something in the chat about wanting to do a cost-benefit analysis and not really being able to, unfortunately. It's obviously remarkable, though, from looking at these papers, that the caseload and the cases that some of these centres were doing independent of their collaborators who were visiting, when they weren't visiting, seemed to increase year on year. Particularly, there's a paper from Myanmar where their own practice was seen to increase year on year, with both when there were visiting surgeons and when there weren't, which does indicate that there is an appetite to be doing these operations. Something that I put in the chat box from Nepal was that even when the collaborators weren't the foreign collaborators weren't present, they were still receiving some funding for each of the flaps they did. And I think that helped them to support their practice and grow their practice. But from anecdotally, what Kiran Nakami said to me was that, they still weren't really necessarily covering all of their costs. And for the most part, a lot of the surgeons basically work for free during these cases because they think that they're valuable cases to be doing and great training. The other interesting thing that they mentioned in their paper actually is that some of the surgeons are taking their microsurgical reconstructive surgery training and using that to do operations that would be conventionally done by other specialties like coronary bypass grafting or recannulation of the vas deferens. So these microsurgery skills, although people might think that reconstructive surgery is a luxury, which I think most of us here might argue it's not, these skills are transferable and may lead to knock-on effects that we hadn't really that the people who are engaging in these collaborations hadn't really perceived. But I think that this will probably all lead into Prof. McConan talking in more depth about what a difference that this sort of surgery could make in his centre.
Well, thank you for that, Henry. That's actually sort of hitting the nail on the head of what I think lots of us would have been thinking about and dwelling on the discussion points. I think this might be a good time as we draw sort of towards the end of the section by section review, would be for Mr. Reid to ask about what the publishing experience was from a JPRAS point of view.
Thank you. Yes. So for Henry and Prof. McConan, I was keen to know why you felt that you should publish in JPRAS, and what the experience was like for you in terms of the reviewers' comments, and the kind of time to come back and things like that. For context, I handled this paper, and the reviewers were one an experienced surgeon with good experience, who usually works in a high-income country, and good experience of working in low-income countries and teaching microsurgery. And then the other reviewer was a plastic surgeon in a low-income country, who was keen to develop microsurgical capabilities within their unit.
I was mainly interfacing with JPRAS, so I guess I'll take this mainly. So I think in recognition of the broad authorship and also potentially the impact of this work, JPRAS very generously waived our fee, which was a really positive thing. And in addition to that, I know this is a classic thing to say, having got past them, but the reviewers were actually very helpful, and it didn't feel like they were picking holes. They were, generally positive about the work, and you can get a bit carried away writing a paper with what you want it to show, rather than what it actually shows. And frankly, we would have loved to have more data in our paper, more high quality data, and it just wasn't there. But they kind of helped us to be honest about that, I think, rather than try, where we made some assertions in our discussion which were probably not fully underpinned by the data. They called us out on that quite clearly. But that was actually quite useful. And we did go back to the authors of the individual papers individually and speak to each one of them after getting our review feedback to try and get more data off them. So I think hopefully actually that process made it a much better paper. It didn't take too long either. I mean, lots of the people here will have experienced applying for their interviews, and it places a completely ridiculous short time frame on what you expect from an academic process. So I was quite stressed about all the timings, but it actually it was pretty smooth, and I think they were pretty prompt with their replies.
You're probably already touching on some of the things in the limitations here, and what you've said is true, Henry. There's only so much that you can get from a case series, and it's so important to critically analyze that and not make it say, oh, well, all these papers seem to think that this result was important and this one wasn't. And yes, we can take these things with a pinch of salt, but I think a collation of studies that fine or not level 1 evidence comparative trials is still valuable. And I think by giving us crude estimates of what the flap failure rate is as a result of these collaborations, you've given us some important information. And as long as you draw conclusions that are not, this is the flap failure rate and free flap surgery is safe across all LMICs, you're still giving us really important information, and we can use it for value for sure. So well done.
But I think what it also does is opens discussions like today. So even if perhaps, you've clearly highlighted that obviously there's not enough evidence or high quality data to make a guaranteed conclusion of something. But what it does is it opens up a discussion point that perhaps is something that we do need to work on. And hopefully your paper opens that door to further papers that will, and further research that will allow us to have high level data and high level evidence, So I always think it's important, and I think that it's a really relevant topic. It's something that I perhaps was thinking about myself, of like, when having been out, is that you don't get much research. And I think it's such an important thing to get high quality research that we can help better and base it on, you can probably get funding if you have something to statistically base it on, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'd love to ask one final question on this to Prof. McConan. So I suppose touching on what Haneen said, what do you think are the main barriers to being able to carry out high level research in Ethiopia specifically, or in your hospital, Prof? You might still be. Oh, there we go.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. Well, I think to performing high-level surgery, the barriers are multiple. The main thing is there is no expertise. There is no training to this level. Training of surgeons, for example, to perform microsurgery. there is no trained microsurgeon, there is no trained anesthesia staff, there is no trained nurses, and the tradition is not also there. For many years we thought that microsurgery is a luxury. When we think that there are a lot of people waiting outside, spending a lot of hours on a single surgery, we thought it is like maybe a luxury. But now it is not like that, because it is sometimes maybe it is like saving a limb. When you don't have any option or for coverage, there is no local option or regional option, then you intend to, for example, amputate a leg. So the thinking is now changing, but still there is a scarcity of many things. There is no equipment. In many places, the operating theaters are smaller, cannot accommodate microscope. So there is no, the tradition is not there, like using maybe a simple loop, you can do microsurgery, but the main thing which is lacking is the training. And also obviously equipment and consumables. As Adam mentioned, consumables are really very expensive and available. Getting fine sutures is really very difficult. So still the barriers are there, but now there is a change in mentality that microsurgery is not a luxury. Microsurgery is, plastic surgery alone is incomplete without microsurgery. Sometimes we'll be handicapped when you see a case, oh, this could have been good for microsurgery, but we don't have. I think we shouldn't continue saying that. There should be a change.
I think that leads us very nicely into your slides, Prof. So if you like, I'll click through and you can voice over and just let me know when you want to change slide. So Prof. McCunnan's very kindly put together just a couple cases that he and his team feel would be lovely examples of where a micro capacity would have been useful. So yeah, go ahead.
Can you go directly to the, since many of these things have been said, can we go to the case? And
yeah,
that would be, yeah. For example, this case, she had some sort of infection in her oral cavity, for which she was debrided by NT surgeon, and she was referred to us. The picture is not good, but she lost nearly half of her maxilla on the right side. She also lost her eye, and palate has gone. Half of the palate is not there, both a soft and hard palate. So, for example, this is one of the cases which we thought having microsurgery would have solved a lot. In fact, since we don't have microsurgery, we are thinking now, thinking about doing pedicle radial forearm flap, and maybe to reconstruct only the soft tissue currently to facilitate her speech and make a better speech, and maybe facilitate feeding. Maybe this can be augmented with temporoparital fascia as an inner lining. Obviously, reconstructing the bony part might be very difficult. So I will be very happy to hear your opinion here.
Maybe that's one for Mr. Reid to think about, but obviously a very complex problem. I'd love to know what her current functional status is. I think you've probably alluded to the fact that lots of troubles with feeding, lots of trouble with speech.
Yeah, the usually the feeding, they will adapt some sort of mechanism. She can somehow eat with some problem, but her speech is terribly cannot understand it. It's not, she cannot speak intelligibly.
That's far too complex for a mere limb surgeon. Are there any other head and neck surgeons on the line?
Head and neck surgeons, like there is maxillofacial surgery activity, but there is no experience with free tissue transfer.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think you're right. You probably need, a composite reconstruction, including bone, lining, skin, and possibly multiple operations, and then maybe something else to look at her eye. But you're right. You're probably only going to achieve something like that with free tissue transfer. So it would be maybe the only solution for someone like this. Do you want, Prof, me to move you on to your next case?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a young boy who has got electric burn. As you can see, he was managed somewhere and then referred to us. You can see all the problems discussed in this boy. Is malnourished. The infection is cleaned really recently with a lot of struggle. And now he has this exposed bone. It's partly in the middle third and distal third of the leg. So it is nearly circumferential. There is no possibility for any transposition, local flap. As you see, the bone exposed. What we did was we discussed many times since the sural flap, reverse sural flap from the other leg is used, a pedicle reverse sural flap. You can see how he has to remain in this position for 3 weeks. After that, maybe his knee will be stiff. Many things like so. This is why we say like microsurgery is cost effective. You'll be, if he has got free tissue transfer, he will be rehabilitated earlier, and you'll maybe go back to work faster. But now he will remain in bed for many weeks.
Yeah, that's such a good point from an economic standpoint, because you're looking at the whole picture, not just the surgical episode. You're looking at the 3-week admission and also the potential national economic loss of the patient not being able to work. But I think as well, looking at a reconstruction like this in reverse and applying it in a higher income country, it would be, I can't imagine that many patients, for example, in the UK, would be happy with the 3 weeks of bed rest. They'd say, what? You want me to what? So yeah, I think you're right. This would be a beautiful case for a free flap.
Yeah. Any suggestion? Any?
I mean, from my point of view, I think you've done a great job to get this covered. Clearly, the morbidity of a cross-leg flap is the thing that you're trying to avoid with free tissue transfer, which I think would be the gold standard here. The other options that have been used increasingly in Ukraine are the use of VTM, or a kind of biodegradable temporizing matrix. These are quite expensive, and that's the drawback with them. But use of something like that to get a matrix to cover the tibia and then be able to graft over it avoids the need for microsurgical reconstruction as well.
The other advantage there is, this patient's malnourished, and had an infection. So the use of a dermal matrix in that setting might be even preferable. But who knows?
Yeah, that is not available here. Also, availability is also an issue.
Yeah. Shall I move on to your next case?
Move to the next case. And this is a 50 years old lady. She was have some sort of attack, and she got burned. She has got burn injury, and she was managed somewhere, and later on she was referred to our unit for possible reconstruction. As you can see, her elbow joint is exposed, the joint is exposed, and bone is also exposed. So first we thought maybe we can use a pedicled LED flap. But on the table, when we measure it, it will not cover the whole wound. Because I don't know if you can see my indicator. It's not only the elbow joint bone which is exposed, it is also the ulna distal is also exposed. So you need something bigger. And the LED might cover only the elbow, but it will not cover what is distally. So she has also a small wound on her breast. Move to the next slide, please. So we used a random abdominal flap to cover the elbow and the exposed ulnar bone. You know, she has to remain in this position for 3 weeks. She's a 50 years old lady. Maybe after 3 weeks, she will have a frozen shoulder, which will be stiff and troubling her. So, you know, in some of the cases, maybe amputation will be preferred. So this was one of the cases where we thought why it would be very nice if we can do microsurgery for this. There are many other cases like this. I've only picked a few of these. Any comments from the audience?
Great bailout, well done. This is this has saved her limb. So that's a good result. I think you're right. We would use microsurgical soft tissue transfer here. As with the cross leg flap, I suspect the key here is physio. So in this case, hand therapy and ensuring that the hand doesn't go stiff and swollen as well as the elbow and shoulder, which are going to sustain some significant stiffness after this. But that's great. Did everything heal? Did the joint heal? Because that's the big risk with an injury like that.
Yeah, I think the elbow joint is not a problem. If it remains in this position, at least it is in a functional position. As you mentioned, with a good physiotherapy, she can eat with her hand, she can clean herself, she can do at least basic functions. The worry is in her shoulder.
Yeah. So I think that brings us to a close. Prof, I wonder if you want to comment on your last slide here about what you think the way forward is for us in collaboration.
Yeah, I think, you know, I myself thought that microsurgery, when I started practicing, I got the chance to see some microsurgery cases in Norway and in India. I thought this is really not for us because it is time taking, it's resource consuming. So I thought, but now, you know, I changed my mind. Now I think microsurgery should be reconstructive surgery without microsurgery is not really, there is some deficiency. So, so I think there should be some sort of microsurgery activity, at least in a teaching hospitals, not everywhere, but in a very selected 1 or 2 centers. It should be available for a country, big country like ours. So the cases and we see every time made me change mind that we have to have some sort of possibility for doing microsurgery. That is a conclusion from my side.
I think that's a very, very reasonable conclusion. And you've actually given us this potential solution here in that, you know, it could be centralized, which makes sense from a funding point of view and a skill set point of view. And that's definitely something for us all to think about. Have we got any final comments from the panel or audience members?
In the chat, Nat H has commented on the excellent outcome of that poor lady with the burn to her elbow. And then Raphael has been talking about Proximi and how the potential uses for Proximi in the future, which I think is a whole other discussion, and hopefully one we'll be able to do soon.
Yeah. Oh, well, I just want to thank you all so much for your contribution, both audience members, guest panelists from BSSH and BFIRST. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I'm so happy to have Prof. McConan on the call with us to give us a perspective from Ethiopia and many useful, interesting insights into what could be solutions for the provision of care there and elsewhere.